Section 9.2 is on solving quadratic equations by graphing. So as we saw in the last section, a quadratic function is a function of the form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And this should look familiar from the last chapter. A quadratic equation looks very similar to that, ax squared plus bx plus c, but this equals 0. So the solutions of a quadratic equation are the x values when y equals 0 in the quadratic function. Look at these two equations here. They look basically the same. It's just this one has a y equals and this one has an equal 0. So the solution is when y equals 0. So to solve this equation by graphing, we're going to graph the related function. So we're going to kind of ignore the equals 0 and kind of put a y equals in front of it. And then we're going to find where that graph crosses the x-axis. These are the points where y is equal to 0. So basically, graph it and find where it crosses the x-axis. So let's take a look at several examples here. Oops. Okay, solve each quadratic equation by graphing. So we have x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. So in order to do this, I'm going to actually do this on my graphing calculator. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to graph y equals x squared minus 4x plus 3. Actually, before we do that, why don't we try to figure out what the vertex is going to be? So that's going to, or at least the x of the vertex. So remember, x is equal to negative b, so a negative 4 over 2 times a, or 4 over 2, or 2. So that's going to help us when we go ahead and make a table. So the x of my vertex is going to be 2. So let's go ahead and pull up the graphing calculator. And in order to graph, I'm going to use this top left gray button y equals. And let's push that. And it'll bring up this screen. And notice it says y equals. And notice you can graph a whole bunch of functions all at the same time, but we're only going to do one right now. So I need to graph. Oh shoot, I don't remember what it is. Hold on here. Okay, so it's x squared minus 4x plus 3. Sorry about that. So to do x squared, I'm going to use this button right here that has an x, a t, a theta, and an n on it. Whoops. Let's press that button right there. So that gives me an x. My squared button is over here on the left, x squared. And then I need minus 4, and I'll go back to my x, and then plus 3. And one thing you should be aware of, maybe you're already aware of, is there's a difference between the negative, which is down here beneath the 3, and the minus, which is over here on the right-hand side. So just make sure you're not putting a minus 4x, I'm sorry, yeah, negative 4x, but make it a minus 4x. And now to graph this, I'm going to hit this top right gray button that says graph. And it'll take a minute here, and it draws my graph. Okay, now I'm not going to let you just get away with that. I'm going to want you to be able to make a table of values and then graph it from that. The cool thing is your calculator will make a table of values for you also. See above the red graph button here, or it's actually highlighted right now in red, it says table and it's in blue. So if I hit second and graph, it'll bring up a table. And I've already got some numbers in there. But the main thing I want to do is I noticed that my vertex was, the x of my vertex was 2, so I'd like to choose 2 values smaller than that and 2 values larger than that. So I can just go ahead and put in 0, enter, 1, enter, 2, enter, 3, enter, and 4, enter. And those give me my values that I'm going to put in my table. So let's go ahead and copy that back over on the over here. So x and y, and my values were 0, 3, 1, 0, 2, negative 1, 3, 0, and 4, 3. So let's go ahead and graph those. I'll do it in pink. Did I get pink? Yeah. Okay. 0, 3, 1, 0, 2, negative 1, 3, 0, and 4, 3. Okay, so all I've done so far is just graph this the related function of this equation. Now I need to figure out what its solutions are. And remember, I said the solutions are where it crosses the x-axis. So these 2 points right here at, oops, sorry about that, at x equals 1 and x equals 3. Those are my 2 solutions, the 2 points, 2 x coordinates where the graph crosses the x-axis. Now, you'll notice that at those 2 points, when x is 1 and x is 3, my y is equal to 0. And that's no coincidence. That's the way it's supposed to be. So I'm looking for the x coordinates when y is equal to 0 or when the graph crosses the x-axis. Okay, let's take a look at another example here. So here I have x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So I'm going to go ahead and find my the x of my vertex. So x equals negative b over 2 times a, or negative 8 over 4, or my x is a negative 4. So when I go to make my table of values that I'll copy from the calculator, I'm going to put negative 4 in the middle, and I'll choose 2 values smaller and 2 values larger. So let's go to the calculator and put that in. So I go back to y equals, and I can hit clear to get rid of that. And I need x squared plus 8x plus 16. And then go ahead and hit the graph button. And I get a graph that looks like that. Now let's get some values to fill in on our table. So second graph, and I started with negative 6, enter, negative 5, enter, negative 4, enter, negative 3, and negative 2. And you can just ignore the rest of these numbers. I'm only interested in these first 5 that I put in. So I have my y's are 4, 1, 0, 1, 4. And again, they're symmetric like we saw in the last section. Makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and fill those in. So that was 4, 1, 0, 1, and 4. Let's go ahead and graph that. So negative 6, 4, negative 5, 1, negative 4, 0, 3, negative 3, 1, and negative 2, 4. Go ahead and draw that curve. And I can see that my graph technically doesn't cross the x-axis, but it just touches the x-axis only in one point right here, where x is equal to negative 4. So that's my one solution. So in this case, this quadratic equation has just one solution because it touches the x-axis only in one point. And that actually makes sense from my table because at this point right here, my y is 0, so I need the x value. Let's take a look at our next equation. So here we have negative x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0. Let's find the x of our vertex. So x equals negative b over 2 times a, or the x of my vertex is going to be 1. Let's set up our table of values. I'll put 1 in the middle, choose 2 values smaller and 2 values larger, and let's go to our calculator to graph this. So hitting y equals, and I will clear that out. Now, since my equation started with a negative x squared, I need to use this negative button underneath the 3. Negative x squared plus 2x minus 3. And I'll hit graph. And it gives me a graph that looks like that. Now, I can tell by looking at this that this has no solution because the graph never crosses the x-axis. But let's go ahead and get some values to make our table so that I can copy the graph. So second graph gives me the table, and I was going to start with a negative 1, enter, 0, enter, 1, enter, 2, and 3. And that gives me my y values of -6, -3, -2, -3, and -6. Let's copy those back onto our table. And let's graph this. So -1, -6, 0, -3, 1, -2, 2, -3, and 3, -6. And as you can see, it does not cross the x-axis. So this equation has no solution. And looking at the table of values, that kind of makes sense, because going from -6 to -3, I'm getting bigger, heading closer to the x-axis. From -3 to -2, I'm going up, but then I start going back down again. So this graph will never cross the x-axis no matter how many points I draw. And let's take a look at one last example here. Okay, we have x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. Let's find the x of our vertex. So x equals -b over 2 times a, or 4 over 2, or 2. That's going to be the value in the middle of my table. 2x is smaller, 2x is larger, and let's go to the calculator. So y equals, and we'll clear that out and start over, and we had x squared minus 4x plus 2. Let's take a look at our graph. So good, this one does have two solutions because it does cross the x-axis. And let's get a table of values, some numbers to put in. And we start our table with 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and that gave me y values of 2, -1, -2, -1, and 2. So that was 2, -1, -2, -1, and 2. Let's go ahead and graph those. So 0, 2, 1, -1, 2, -2, 3, -1, and 4, 2. And in this graph, you'll notice that it does, the pink parabola does cross the x-axis, but it crosses like right here and right here, and that's between two values. So it looks like I have values between x equals 0 and x equals 1. And between 1, 2, 3, between 3 and 4. Here's a really cool way to write this. To say between 0 and 1, I can say 0 is less than x is less than 1. In other words, x is a number between 0 and 1, and the same thing for 3 and 4. 3 is less than x, which is less than 4, and that's my answer. So they're actually probably irrational numbers, not exact numbers that are between those two whole numbers, between those two integers. Now let's take a look at the table here and see what's going on. So before we were looking for what was the x when y was 0. Well, I don't see any zeros here, but I do see that between these two numbers, between +2 and -1, on the number line there is a 0. So that means that my solution is going to be between x equals 0 and x equals 1. Also down here between -1 and 2, there's a 0 in between there. So my other solution is going to be between 3 and 4. So in this lesson we took a look at solving quadratic equations by graphing. And when you graph, you can have two solutions, you can have one solution, you can have no solution, or you can have two solutions that are between two integer values.